The afternoon sun streamed through the large windows of Gate C-23 as passengers for Flight 237 began the boarding process. The usual airport buzz filled the air, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the mix of excited vacation chatter and tired business traveler sighs. Among the first aboard was a well-dressed boy of about 12. He wore neat khaki pants, a blue button-up shirt, and carried a backpack that seemed almost too big for his slim frame. His dark skin contrasted with the bright, eager smile he gave the flight attendant who checked his boarding pass. "First class, all by yourself?" the attendant asked with a warm smile. "Yes, ma'am," the boy replied politely. "My dad's flying too, but he's sitting in economy today. He says it's good for business." The flight attendant nodded approvingly as she directed him to his seat. The boy settled into 2A, a plush window seat in the first-class cabin. He immediately pulled out a thick book about modern aircraft design and began reading, occasionally glancing out the window to watch the ground crew prepare the plane. 20 minutes later, as boarding continued, Patricia Winters made her way down the jet bridge with the practiced confidence of someone who believed herself entitled to move through the world unimpeded. Her designer handbag alone probably cost more than what many people on the plane earned in a month. Her hair was freshly colored and styled, her nails perfectly manicured, and her face set in an expression that suggested she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. Patricia checked her boarding pass again, seat 2B, and made her way to the first-class cabin. When she reached her row, she stopped abruptly. The boy didn't notice her immediately, engrossed as he was in his reading. "Excuse me," Patricia said, her voice already tight with displeasure. "I believe you might be in the wrong seat." The boy looked up, momentarily confused. He checked his boarding pass. "No, ma'am. I'm in 2A. Are you in 2B?" Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line as she realized she would be sitting next to this child for the 3-hour flight. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat down without another word, her body language communicating clear discomfort as she angled herself away from the boy. The boy sensed the tension but returned to his book, used to navigating uncomfortable social situations with quiet dignity despite his young age. As more passengers filled the plane, Patricia's discomfort seemed to grow. She kept glancing at the boy, then at her watch, then at the still boarding passengers. Finally, when a flight attendant passed by, Patricia raised her hand. "Excuse me," she called out in a stage whisper that was actually louder than her normal speaking voice. Sophia, the flight attendant, approached with a professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Patricia leaned forward slightly. "I need to change my seat," she said, her eyes darting briefly toward the boy. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked today," Sophia replied. "Is there a problem with your current seat?" Patricia's voice lowered, though not enough. "I paid good money for first class. I was expecting a certain environment." Her eyes again flicked toward the boy, who was pretending to read, but had stopped turning pages. Sophia's smile remained fixed, but her eyes cooled. "I assure you, ma'am, all our first-class passengers have paid for their seats." "That's not what I meant," Patricia huffed. "Surely there must be another arrangement possible. Perhaps someone would trade. Or maybe he could move instead." She didn't even bother lowering her voice for this last suggestion. Other first-class passengers were now watching the interaction. An older gentleman across the aisle frowned disapprovingly at Patricia. A woman 2 rows up had turned completely around in her seat to observe. The boy finally spoke up, his voice steady but quiet. "It's okay. I can ask my dad what to do when he boards in a few minutes." Patricia looked momentarily appeased by this, settling back in her seat with a satisfied nod, completely missing the growing disapproval from everyone around her. Sophia, the flight attendant, gave the boy a sympathetic look before moving on, mentally preparing herself for when this woman would inevitably discover exactly who this child's father was. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She kept looking around, hoping to catch another flight attendant's eye. The boy had returned to his book, but his shoulders were hunched now, his earlier excitement visibly dampened. "This is ridiculous," Patricia muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. She pulled out her phone and began aggressively scrolling through it, occasionally sighing loudly for effect. A middle-aged couple seated across the aisle exchanged glances. The woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something that made him frown and shake his head. Sophia, the flight attendant from earlier, returned with a stack of hot towels. "Would either of you care for a refreshing towel before takeoff?" she asked, her professional tone unwavering. "Finally, some service," Patricia said, snatching a towel. "While you're here, I really must insist on speaking to your supervisor about my seating arrangement. I'm a platinum member with over 50,000 miles this year alone." Sophia's smile remained fixed as she handed a towel to the boy, who accepted it with a quiet thank you. "Ma'am, as I mentioned, the flight is completely full today. There are no other available seats in first class," Sophia explained patiently. By now, most of the first-class cabin was tuned into the drama unfolding. An elderly woman 3 rows up had removed her reading glasses to better observe the situation. A businessman had paused his pre-flight routine, his newspaper lowered just enough to watch over the top of it. "Look," Patricia said, her voice rising, "I paid nearly $2,000 for this seat. I didn't pay that kind of money to babysit someone else's child." She gestured toward the boy without even looking at him. The boy's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but he kept his eyes on his book, turning a page even though he clearly hadn't been reading. "Ma'am," Sophia responded, her voice dropping slightly, "I must ask you to lower your voice. All our passengers deserve respect, regardless of their age." Patricia scoffed. "I deserve respect too. And comfort. I have important business meetings after this flight, and I need to arrive refreshed and prepared." By now, several economy passengers making their way to the back of the plane had slowed their pace, rubbernecking at the commotion in first class. The boy finally looked up from his book. Despite the humiliation written across his face, he spoke with remarkable composure. "I'm sorry you're uncomfortable, ma'am. My dad should be boarding soon. Maybe he can help sort this out." Patricia looked directly at him for the first time. "Your father should have taught you that there are appropriate places for children, and a business-class cabin isn't one of them." A collective intake of breath came from those within earshot. Sophia's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flash of anger before she regained her composure. "Ma'am, that's enough," she said firmly. "This young man has every right to be in this cabin with his valid ticket. If you continue to disturb other passengers, I'll need to involve the captain." Patricia's mouth fell open in indignation. "Are you threatening me? Do you have any idea who I am? I could have your job with one phone call." "And who might you be calling?" came a deep, measured voice from the aisle. Everyone turned to see a tall, imposing man in an expertly tailored suit standing there. His presence commanded attention without him having to say another word. His eyes, identical to the boy's, moved from Patricia to his son, quickly assessing the situation. The boy's face lit up with relief. "Dad." Patricia's expression froze somewhere between anger and sudden uncertainty. Something about this man's confident demeanor made her pause. The other passengers watched with undisguised interest as the man stepped closer to their row. Even the flight attendants further down the cabin had paused their preparations, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. "Is there a problem involving my son?" the man asked, his tone polite, but with an unmistakable edge of authority that made Patricia squirm slightly in her seat. The first-class cabin went pin-drop silent as the well-dressed man stood in the aisle. He was tall with broad shoulders, and his crisp navy suit looked like it had been made specifically for him, which it probably had. His presence seemed to make the cabin feel smaller somehow. "Dad," the boy said again, relief washing over his face. The man placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Everything okay, buddy?" he asked, though his eyes were fixed on Patricia, who was suddenly finding her phone incredibly interesting. "This lady doesn't want to sit next to me," the boy explained quietly. "She asked if I could move." The father's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. When he spoke, his voice remained calm and measured. "Is that so?" Patricia looked up, clearly trying to regain her composure. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. I simply mentioned that I usually prefer to sit next to other business travelers. I have some work to prepare for before landing." The man nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I see. And sitting next to my son would prevent you from doing your work because—" Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The other passengers were watching the exchange like it was the final scene of a movie they'd been waiting all year to see. "Well, children can be disruptive," she said, her voice faltering slightly under his steady gaze. The father glanced at his son's aviation book, then back at Patricia. "My son has been flying since he was 4 years old. He knows how to behave on an aircraft better than most adults." He didn't raise his voice, but there was a weight to his words that made them land heavily. Sophia, the flight attendant, stepped forward. "Sir, would you like me to find another solution?" "We can." "That won't be necessary, thank you," the man said, giving her a warm smile that transformed his serious face. "I'm sure this lady and my son will get along just fine for the next few hours." Patricia seemed to be regaining some of her earlier boldness. "Look, I'm a very frequent flyer with this airline. I've been a platinum member for years, and I expect certain standards when I pay for first class." The man raised an eyebrow. "Frequent flyer, you say?" "Very frequent," Patricia emphasized, lifting her chin slightly. "I probably take 40 flights a year with this airline. I know most of the staff on this route by name." The father nodded thoughtfully. 40 flights. That's impressive. His tone suggested it wasn't actually that impressive at all. "And you've been flying with this airline for how long?" "Nearly 8 years," she said, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "I'm practically family at this point." A small smile played at the corner of the man's mouth. Family. That's an interesting choice of words. The businessman with the newspaper had completely abandoned any pretense of reading. An older woman across the aisle was openly staring. Even a flight attendant preparing drinks at the front galley had paused to listen. The father reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather card holder. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," he said, extracting a business card and holding it out to Patricia. "I'm David Johnson." Patricia took the card automatically, glancing down at it. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment it seemed she might faint. You're, she stammered, looking from the card to the man and back again. "The CEO?" David finished for her. "Yes, among other things. I also own 60% of the airline's shares." He smiled at his son. "Which makes him something of an heir to the company you're so fond of." The reactions around them varied from shocked gasps to poorly concealed snickers. The elderly woman 3 rows up was covering her mouth with her hand, eyes twinkling with delight at the turn of events. Patricia looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, but no words came out. "Now," David said pleasantly, "you were saying something about family?" Patricia stared at the business card in her trembling hands. The embossed gold lettering seemed to mock her. David Johnson, Chief Executive Officer, Altitude Airlines. Below that, in slightly smaller text, Majority Shareholder. She swallowed hard. The first-class cabin felt suddenly airless, as if someone had adjusted the oxygen levels. Her ears were ringing. I had no idea," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled politely. "Most passengers don't. I prefer it that way, actually. Gives me a chance to experience our service as a regular customer would." He glanced at his son. "And it allows my boy to travel without too much fuss. He loves flying, don't you, buddy?" The boy nodded, a small smile returning to his face now that his father was handling the situation. "I've read every book in the library about airplanes," he told his dad, as if Patricia wasn't even there. "This one explains how the new engines on our fleet reduce fuel consumption by almost 20%. David beamed with pride. "He knows more about our aircraft than most of our pilots," he said to no one in particular, though everyone was listening. "He could probably fly this plane if we let him." A few passengers chuckled. The tension in the cabin was shifting, morphing from uncomfortable confrontation to something that felt more like entertainment at Patricia's expense. Sophia, the flight attendant, approached with renewed confidence. "Mr. Johnson, it's wonderful to see you again. Would you like your usual seat? We've kept 4C open, as requested." David nodded. "Thank you, Sophia. And how's your mother doing after her surgery last month?" Sophia's face lit up. "Much better, sir. She was so touched by the flowers you sent." Patricia's eyes darted between them, the reality of her situation sinking in deeper with every word. This wasn't just some executive who occasionally flew on the airline. This was someone who knew his staff personally, who remembered details about their lives. "Mr. Johnson," the captain's voice suddenly came over the PA system, "welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you with us today. Weather looks good all the way to our destination. Should be a smooth ride for you and your son." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin as other passengers realized exactly who was among them. A few people craned their necks to get a better look. One passenger even took out his phone to snap a discreet photo before a quick glare from Sophia made him think better of it. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear. She stared straight ahead, her face a rigid mask of mortification. David turned his attention back to her. "Now, about your seating preferences," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "I understand completely. Everyone wants to be comfortable on their flight." Patricia started to nod gratefully, thinking perhaps she was being offered an escape route. "Fortunately," David continued, "I have a solution. Sophia, could you please check if there are any seats available on tomorrow morning's flight? I believe it departs at 5:45 a.m. Sophia barely managed to suppress a smile. "Of course, Mr. Johnson." Patricia's eyes widened. "Tomorrow? But I have meetings this afternoon. I can't possibly." "Oh no, I thought your comfort was the priority," David said, his voice all concern though his eyes remained cool. "Since you find sitting next to my son so unbearable for a 3-hour flight, I assumed you'd prefer to wait for more suitable arrangements." The businessman with the newspaper wasn't even pretending not to listen anymore. He was openly grinning. The elderly woman 3 rows up gave a small, satisfied nod of approval. I didn't mean," Patricia sputtered, her carefully applied makeup doing nothing to hide the flush creeping up her neck. She looked around desperately, but found no allies among the other passengers. David's son watched the exchange with wide eyes, learning a life lesson more valuable than anything in his aviation books. "Well," David prompted, "what would you prefer? To stay on this flight seated next to my son, or to wait for tomorrow's flight, where we can guarantee you won't have to endure his company?" The question hung in the air between them. Every eye in first class was fixed on Patricia, waiting for her answer. The gentle hum of the aircraft engines seemed to grow louder in the silence. Patricia's mind raced frantically, searching for an escape from the trap she had set for herself. The entire first-class cabin seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for her decision. Even the usual airplane sounds, the hum of engines, the click of overhead bins, the rustle of passengers settling in, seemed muted. "That won't be necessary," she finally stammered. "This seat is perfectly fine." David nodded, his expression neutral. "You're certain? Because I want all our passengers to be completely comfortable, especially our Platinum members." There was just the slightest emphasis on those last 2 words. "Completely certain," Patricia said quickly. Her voice had risen half an octave, and a bead of sweat trickled down her temple despite the cabin's cool air conditioning. "Very well then," David said. He turned to his son with a warm smile that completely transformed his face. "I'll be in 4C if you need anything, champ. Enjoy your book." The boy nodded, still a bit subdued but visibly relieved that the unpleasant situation was resolving. "Thanks, Dad." David straightened up and buttoned his suit jacket with a practiced motion. He turned to address the flight attendant. "Sophia, please make sure my son gets whatever he needs during the flight." "Of course, Mr. Johnson," Sophia replied with a genuine smile, not the practiced customer service one she had been using with Patricia. As David turned to make his way to his seat, he paused and addressed Patricia one last time. "Oh, and Ms. Winters," Patricia supplied automatically, then immediately regretted giving him her name. "Ms. Winters, I do hope you'll fill out our customer satisfaction survey after the flight. We'd value feedback from all our passengers." His tone was perfectly professional, but there was no mistaking the message. "I'll remember your name." With that, he walked away, stopping occasionally to shake hands with crew members who clearly knew and respected him. Several passengers leaned into the aisle to watch him go, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Left alone with the boy, Patricia sat rigidly in her seat, staring straight ahead. Her mind was already calculating the damage. Would he blacklist her from the airline? Would her name be flagged in their system? Would she become known as that woman in boardroom stories for years to come? The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, but Patricia barely noticed. She was too busy replaying every word she had said, each one now seeming more horrifying than the last. Beside her, the boy quietly returned to his book. Unlike most kids his age, he didn't seem to take any pleasure in her discomfort. If anything, he seemed to be trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable, as if he'd learned long ago that this was sometimes the safest way to exist in the world. That realization hit Patricia like a physical blow. This child was used to people like her, people who took one look at his skin color and made assumptions about where he belonged. The thought made something uncomfortable twist in her stomach. The plane began to taxi, and Patricia found herself gripping the armrests so tightly her knuckles turned white. It wasn't fear of flying that had her on edge. It was the crushing weight of public humiliation combined with the first faint stirrings of something that felt uncomfortably like shame. Across the aisle, the businessman who had been enjoying the show caught her eye and shook his head slightly before returning to his newspaper. 2 rows up, a woman who had witnessed everything whispered something to her travel companion, and they both glanced back at Patricia with undisguised judgment. For the first time in her adult life, Patricia found herself on the receiving end of the very same dismissive looks she had given others countless times before. She was being sized up, found wanting, and dismissed, all without a word being spoken. As the plane gathered speed down the runway, Patricia closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 3 hours. She had to endure just 3 hours sitting next to this child whose father owned the very plane they were on. 3 hours of knowing that every flight attendant on board had probably already heard about what she'd done. 3 hours of feeling the weight of disapproving glances from her fellow passengers. The plane lifted off the ground, and Patricia knew with absolute certainty that this was going to be the longest flight of her life. 30 minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Patricia had barely moved, sitting stiffly with her eyes fixed on the screen in front of her without actually watching anything. The boy beside her had continued reading his book, occasionally making notes in a small pad with a pencil. Sophia approached their row with the drink cart. "What can I get for you?" she asked the boy first, her smile warm and genuine. "Apple juice, please," he replied politely. "Of course." Sophia poured his drink and placed it on his tray along with a small package of cookies. "And these are special. We usually save them for our crew, but I think you might enjoy them." The boy's face lit up. "Thank you." Sophia then turned to Patricia with a markedly cooler expression. "And for you, ma'am?" "Just water," Patricia mumbled. When Sophia handed her the plastic cup, Patricia noticed it was only half full. A small, petty revenge, but effective. She didn't dare complain. As the flight progressed, Patricia couldn't help noticing how the cabin crew doted on the boy. They stopped to chat about his book, brought him extra snacks, and made sure he was comfortable. Meanwhile, they treated her with bare minimum courtesy, not unprofessional enough to complain about, but noticeably chillier than their interactions with other passengers. About halfway through the flight, a distinguished-looking older man made his way up from economy. He wore an expensive suit that had seen better days and carried himself with dignity. He stopped at their row and nodded to the boy. "Mr. Johnson wanted me to check on you," he said with a slight accent. "Everything good up here?" The boy nodded. "Yes, Mr. Okafor. Everything's fine." Mr. Okafor glanced at Patricia, his expression unreadable. "And your seatmate? She is being pleasant company?" Patricia felt her face burn. The question wasn't directed at her, but about her, as if she weren't even present. "It's okay," the boy said quietly. "I'm just reading my book." Mr. Okafor nodded. "Very good. Your father will be pleased." With one last measuring look at Patricia, he returned to his seat in economy. "Who was that?" Patricia found herself asking before she could stop herself. The boy looked up, surprised that she had spoken directly to him. "That's Mr. Okafor. He's my dad's chief financial officer. He's been with the company since before I was born." "And he's sitting in economy." Patricia couldn't hide her surprise. The boy shrugged. "Dad says it's important for executives to experience the airline as regular passengers do. They take turns sitting in different sections on different flights." He hesitated, then added, "Dad says you can't know what needs fixing if you're always in first class." Patricia digested this information slowly. She thought about her own company, where executives wouldn't dream of flying anything but business class at minimum. The boy returned to his book, and Patricia found herself stealing glances at him. He couldn't be more than 12, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that many adults never achieved. She noticed how careful he was with his book, how neat his handwriting was in his notebook, how he said thank you every time a flight attendant came by. Patricia felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. She had assumed so much about this child based on nothing but his appearance. What did that say about her? As the flight entered its final hour, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making good time and should be arriving at our destination about 15 minutes ahead of schedule. And I'd like to personally thank Mr. Johnson for his feedback on our new approach procedures at this airport. It's made all our lives easier. Several passengers looked around, trying to spot which Mr. Johnson the captain was referring to. A man across the aisle caught Patricia's eye and nodded toward the boy. "Kid's dad owns the airline," he whispered loudly, clearly pleased to have insider information. Lady there tried to get him moved. Can you imagine? Patricia sank lower in her seat, wishing the plane would suddenly develop the ability to travel at the speed of light. Every minute of this flight was becoming more excruciating than the last. She had never been so desperate for a journey to end. The boy glanced at her, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small package of mints. After a moment's hesitation, he held them out to her. "Would you like one?" he asked quietly. "My dad says they help with air pressure when we start to land." Patricia stared at the offered mints, momentarily speechless. After everything that had happened, this child was showing her kindness she knew she didn't deserve. Her hand trembled slightly as she took one. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice catching a little. The boy nodded and went back to his book. There was no triumph in his gesture, no sense that he was making a point about being better than her. He was simply being kind because that's who he was. The plane began its descent, the gentle downward tilt pushing them back in their seats. Patricia unwrapped the mint slowly, turning it over in her fingers before putting it in her mouth. The sharp peppermint taste seemed to clear not just her sinuses, but something in her mind as well. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, surprising herself as much as the boy, "for how I acted earlier. It was wrong of me." The boy looked up, his expression cautious but not unkind. "It's okay. It happens a lot." Those 4 words, "it happens a lot," hit Patricia harder than any lecture could have. This child, not even a teenager yet, was already used to people judging him, already accustomed to having to prove he belonged in spaces others entered without question. "It shouldn't," she said, finding it hard to meet his eyes. He shrugged, a gesture too world-weary for someone so young. "My dad says people are afraid of what they don't understand, and sometimes they don't try to understand because they're afraid." Patricia felt something crack inside her chest, a small fissure in the wall she had built around her own privilege and prejudice. This boy was offering her wisdom she hadn't earned, grace she didn't deserve. The landing gear deployed with a mechanical whine, and the flight attendants began their final cabin check. Sophia passed by, giving the boy a warm smile and Patricia a professional nod that was several degrees cooler. As the runway approached, Patricia found herself thinking about the meeting she had scheduled that afternoon. Just hours ago, they had seemed so important. Deals to close, clients to impress, competitors to outmaneuver. Now they felt strangely hollow. The plane touched down with a slight bump, and passengers around them immediately reached for their phones despite the captain's announcement to remain seated until they reached the gate. "What's your name?" Patricia asked as they taxied toward the terminal. The boy looked slightly surprised at the question. "Thomas," he answered. "I'm Patricia," she said, then added with a small attempt at humor, "though I don't imagine your father will remember me fondly." Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Dad doesn't hold grudges. He says life's too short and business is too important." Patricia nodded, taking in this unexpected glimpse into the philosophy of a man who owned an airline but made his executives fly economy. As the plane reached the gate and the seatbelt sign dinged off, the usual chaos of deplaning began. People stood too quickly, pulled bags from overhead bins with dangerous enthusiasm, and jostled for position in the aisle. Patricia remained seated, sensing Thomas wanted to wait for his father. Sure enough, David appeared from the back of the plane, shaking hands with crew members as he made his way forward. When he reached their row, his eyes went first to his son. "Good flight, buddy?" Thomas nodded. "It was okay. I finished my book." David's eyes then shifted to Patricia, and she braced herself for coldness or contempt. Instead, he simply nodded politely. "Ms. Winters." "Mr. Johnson," she replied, swallowing hard. "Your son was very gracious company. You've raised an extraordinary young man." Something softened almost imperceptibly in David's expression. "Thank you. We think so too." He held out his hand to Thomas, who gathered his things and stood up. As they prepared to leave, Thomas pulled something from his backpack, a small package of cookies he'd saved from the snack service. He placed them on Patricia's tray table. "My dad always says sharing something sweet is the best way to end a difficult day," he said simply. Patricia looked from the cookies to the boy's face, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Thomas joined his father in the aisle, and they made their way off the plane together, neither looking back. Patricia sat alone in her seat long after most passengers had deplaned, the small package of cookies in her hand feeling heavier than her expensive designer luggage. Outside the window, she could see David and Thomas walking across the tarmac, the father's hand resting proudly on his son's shoulder. In that moment, despite all her platinum status miles and business success, Patricia had never felt so small or so determined to be better.